Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 2. In this section we are going to start world building. We'll put together a scene, start talking about level design, and figure out what's the best way to construct a world both from grayboxing assets as well as assets from the asset store. So here we are back in Unity, and the first thing we want to do is create a new scene for us. So under File, go to New Scene, and we'll be here with a new scene. We can go ahead and rename this scene. We can either select it and do a save scene as, give it a new name. I'll just put this in a different folder, call this our test scene. And now it is called test scene here. And one of the first things that we'll do is we'll just go ahead and create ground, just so that we can test things out. Ground tends to work well as a plane, so we can go here into this menu, or we can go here to game object and create 3D object, plane or cube. I like to do it here because it just tends to work better from a mental memory perspective to start here. So 3D object, plane. And now we have a plane here. Now one thing that you'll notice is that you're kind of really zoomed in here, and you may be a little bit confused by that. It may not be doing this in your interface, but sometimes if you've been working in Unity for a while, Unity's cameras may be reset to certain areas and so forth. If you ever get anything that looks weird like this, what you want to do is just go over here to the transform and just reset it. And that'll put everything kind of back to some defaults. Now another thing that you're going to want to do is move around the scene. So if you right click with your mouse, you'll see that your mouse pointer changes, and as you move around, this is kind of your mouse look view, so you can look around. You'll also notice that it has the typical arrow keys in that bottom right corner of the icon. So if you push the up arrow, the WASD keys, so if you're like in a first-person shooter and you press the W key, it'll allow you to move around the scene to kind of get yourself set up with where you want to be. So that's one thing that you can do if you're building a world and you need to kind of figure out how things look from different perspectives. Go ahead and right-click, continue holding that mouse button though, and use the WASD keys to kind of move around. Now what we're going to do here is we're just going to put a box in this scene. Nothing really particularly crazy yet. So we'll go here and do 3D object, and we'll create a cube. And now we have a cube in our scene. And this cube we can manipulate a number of different ways. So Unity supports all of the traditional rotate, scale, and move options that you would find in a traditional tool. And those are going to correspond to these tools up here. You have a move tool, you have a rotate tool, you have a scale tool. These are typically the ones that you'd be using a lot of, and Unity has gone through the trouble of actually mapping them to the keyboard. So if you press W, you'll get to the move tool. If you press E, you will get to the rotate tool. If you press R, you'll get to the scale tool. And these are just things that you would want to use if you are doing a lot of manipulation in Unity. Hotkeys are definitely your friend, and these are three that you definitely want to know. So now that we've got our cube here, let's go ahead and make some changes to it. I'll make it a little bit smaller here. So these handles are the different axes that you can manipulate. So you can drag it out in this axis or drag it up in this axis, make it a little bit thinner or wider, whatever you'd like to do there. So that's going to apply to all objects, not just your graphics primitives, but if you bring in an object from the asset store, or you have a 3D model that you bring in from somewhere else and you want to resize it, that's the way you do it. Pressing the S key to get into rotation, you similarly have rotation axes here, so you can rotate across the various axes. And what you'll notice is that as you're making changes over here in the inspector, those values are changing as well. Now, if you want to manipulate something specifically to a fixed value or to a certain value, you can either type that in here. I can go ahead and put in 90 degrees, and that will have set it to a 90-degree rotation from its origin. Or I can hold the mouse over that Y and simply drag it left or right, and I can interactively drag that value. And that's going to apply for a lot of things in Unity. You'll have the ability to select something and move it around. Similarly, as you see, the arrow changes a little bit to one that has a left and right on it. That means that you can hold and drag to the left and right, and it will change that value interactively. Now, one of the controls that I did skip over a little bit because I wanted to touch on that one specifically is the move tool. Now, this particular move is for the camera. So if you want to move the camera around, you want to drag the scene around, that's what this is for. You wouldn't use this for moving around the particular assets within the scene, but if you want to move the perspective of you as the user within that scene, that's what the hand tool is for. Sorry, I called that the move tool before. But that is where you can move your perspective around. Now, this isn't moving the camera because the camera is a specific game object in the scene, and this does not move that. So notice that our camera isn't moving when we drag things around with the move tool. It just changes how we view the scene from the perspective of us, the user. So this is useful if you really want to look at something similarly to our other perspective. You can right click and drag around with the move tool, etc., etc. Using the right click or right mouse button hold is kind of a shortcut for being into the move tool. But this will allow you to better set your perspective so you can see the scene the way that you want to. Now, from time to time, as your scenes get a lot bigger, you're going to end up with tons of objects here, and your world is going to expand well beyond the visual range of what you can see at any one time. But if you need to find an object and you want to focus on a particular object, you simply need to find it in the scene view and just double click on it. So the main camera isn't visible here, but if we double click on the main camera, it brings us to where the camera is, and it centers our user view on the camera. Similarly, if we wanted to center back on the plane, double click on that, and the plane is now at the center. Now the cube is at the center. So that gives you a way to kind of hop around the scene so that you can focus on particular things within that scene. Now, one thing that we talked about in our core concepts piece is the idea of prefabs. So in Unity, a prefab is a template. So if you want to create a lot of the same thing, you would want to use a prefab so that you can simply copy paste it essentially across the world. And similarly, if you change the settings on that prefab, it's going to change them for all of the objects within your scene. So for example, imagine if you have a stop sign and you're kind of putting those around your world, and then later on you find that the texture that you have for the stop sign isn't as good, you want to change it, you would want to change the prefab. You wouldn't want to have to go hunting through your world changing the stop sign texture everywhere. You would want to go to the prefab, change it there, and that would manifest itself throughout the rest of your scene. Now, prefabs are also really important when you're talking about scripting, and we haven't gotten to scripting yet, but it's important to note that if you ever want to instantiate objects on the fly, you can only do that from a prefab. So prefabs are very important when you're dealing with things within Unity. And in general, I always recommend that if you've put something in a scene, there's no penalty to having it be a prefab, so you might as well just make it a prefab now and get it out of the way. So let's say we wanted to create this cube as a prefab. The only thing that requires is we drag the cube out of our scene into our project view, and now it's a prefab. And you can tell it's a prefab because, one, it is blue here. There is a disclosure area here a disclosure arrow here, which will take you into the prefab view, and your prefab will also have a rendering of itself down in the project view. Now, one thing that Unity does now that they didn't used to do is when you create your prefab, the object that was originally in the scene becomes a prefab. Previously, that remained a regular object, and then you would have to drag it into the scene and delete the one that was in the original scene. They've improved all of that. It's a much cleaner approach. It knows you're creating a prefab, and it knows that the object that you had there, you wanted it to be a prefab, so it makes it a prefab. It's very straightforward, and it's a much easier experience to work with. Now, we have our cube here. We know that it's a prefab, and there are two ways that we can open this in the prefab view. One, I mentioned this disclosure arrow. We also have this particular button here where we can open the prefab in its own view. Now, when we talk about its own view, let's go ahead and select this here. You're in a special view for this prefab. Notice that the rest of the scene has disappeared, and the only thing that you're focused on is this particular cube. So as you make changes, you're not distracted by other things. If you wanted to, say, add a texture to it or whatever, you can do that here without having to worry about whether or not you are making some mistakes with other bits of the scene. Now, when I create prefabs, I like them to always be in a location within the project. Now, I have this scenes folder open here, and we'll get to some of the other scenes in other lessons. But if you really want to organize your project the right way, you will have a prefabs folder. And if you want to create a folder, it's simply going down here and saying you want to create a folder, and it will create that new folder for you. I'll just call this one foo. And now you have a foo folder here. And I don't need this, so I can just select it and delete it, and it will go away. But now we want to take our original prefab, which was created in the scene view, and move it into the prefabs view. And I can do that by simply selecting that prefab and dragging it into the prefabs view. And it's just like a Windows or Mac file system operation. It will copy it over into the other location. So now I have my prefab here. So next, let's assume that I want to add some sort of material to this plain vanilla cube. It's not really a cube anymore, this shape. So what we can do is go to materials, and you'll have some materials that you can use, and simply drag that material onto the shape. That's one way that you can add a material to it. If we select our cube, we can see here all of our different bits, and what this has done is it has added a material that was created to our specific cube-ish shape. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this because it's not really a cube. So I'll go back into the main scene view, and I'll rename this to flat surface. And now we have a flat surface. Now notice over in our prefabs, it's still a cube because what we've done is we've renamed it in the scene. So if you want to rename that prefab and not have it be tied to something in the scene or whatever, you can simply right click on it and do rename, and then type the new name. So we can say this is a new flat blue surface. And now that is the name of the prefab. If you look over here, you'll see that that's what that prefab's name is. So that's kind of how you deal with renaming prefabs. Now, if you want to reuse this prefab, you simply drag it out into the scene. And now you have another one, and you have another one, and you have another one, and you have another one. And they all have the same properties, they all have the same attributes, and if you wanted to change them all, you could. So let's go back over into our prefab view. So we'll select our prefab, and we'll go into open prefab, and let's select it in the prefab view. And let's say we want to go ahead and scale that because we don't like the way that it looks. We want it to really be more of a cube. So we go to our scale tool. We'll make it a little bit boxier, not as tall though. So now we have changed it so that it is really more of a cube. And when we return from our prefab view, all of our shapes have changed, all of our prefabs have been updated with that transformation that we made inside the prefab view. So that's really what you use the prefab view for. If ever you're dealing with prefab, you go in, you make your modifications, and that changes for all of the prefabs that you have instantiated from that original prefab. Another very common operation that you're going to want to do is to parent objects to other objects. Why would you want to do that? So let's say you have this world, and this is, for whatever reason, is a section of your scene or your level. You could take all of these prefabs, parent them to the plane, and now whenever you move your plane around, all of those objects move along with it. And that's because they are now parented to it. Similarly, if you rotate the scene around or that object around, all of those objects will rotate in the scene around it. Now this is important because a lot of your level design is going to involve building set pieces which have lots of components that are attached to each other that are going to behave based off of some core mechanic. So you're going to want to have them all attached, parented in a way so that you can adjust a single component, such as this plane in this case, and have that impact all of the other components. When we get into physics, one thing you see is you'll be able to, for example, add a force to the plane and cause all of the things on the plane to be impacted by that force as well. That's very important. So as you're building your levels, you want to keep in mind that you want to group things together in ways that are logical. Don't do it just because, but group them together in ways that are logical so that you can manipulate them all the same way. For your level designers, this is an area where you may want to start looking at a single person is building a part of a scene. They can do that by creating a plane or some other object and building out their scene in that particular section, and then transferring that prefab to someone else so that they can simply add it in to the rest of the world. This would be good, say if you're building a park, somebody can be off building a park and they can do that and then give you the prefab, and you can just drag that park in to your scene without you having to manipulate and set up all the individual objects and transforms and lights and so forth. That's a very powerful feature for you to have when you're doing level design. So even though we're doing this with a set of fairly generic blocks, I do want to demonstrate that concept. So we can take this plane and move it down into our prefabs. And now, as you can see, you have a plane with all of these different objects there. This whole thing has become a prefab. So I can drag that out and have another one, and I can drag that out and have another one. Move our camera so that we aren't right against them. And now as we manipulate these, they're all manipulated as a group. So I could basically snap together a world from a bunch of different pieces, and people can work on those pieces separately. They don't have to all be gathered around the same machine to make sure that they're all laid out properly. And now I know there are a lot of people out there that are having some trouble grasping the concept because we're just working with a flat plane and some boxes and you can't visualize it. Some people can't work without seeing production grade assets. I get it. One of the things you're going to want to do as you do your gameplay design is work with plane objects. But if you're a level designer, you may want to start working with actual assets. So what we're going to do now is talk about pulling down some assets from the asset store. And we do that by selecting the asset store. And if you don't have that tab there, simply go to Window and go to Asset Store, and that tab will show up. And you're going to want to download some art assets that are freely available to you so that you can play around. I have always found this medieval town by Lilac Games to be a very high quality piece of artwork to work with. There are lots of different objects here, lots of different prefabs that you can instantiate into your world and build a whole medieval town. And the graphic quality is actually pretty good. So let's take a look at how we would do that. Now, in this particular case, I've already purchased this asset. I mean, it's free, but I already have access to it. I've downloaded it and so forth. But let's talk about how you would do that yourself. So we will take a look at this Lucas medieval buildings exterior just so that we have an example to work with. We would go into the asset store. We would have given some type of search query here to find the things that we're looking for. One thing that you will be able to do is that you'll be able to go into pricing, and you will be able to select the pricing categories that you're looking for. If you're only looking for free assets, you can click free assets, and the only things that will show up in your search results will be things that are free. There are lots of great free assets on the asset store. There are lots of artists and musicians that publish a lot of things for free, lots of scripts for free, lots of plugins for free. Don't hesitate to search the asset store for free stuff. There's tons of quality, good, free stuff on the asset store. But anyway, going back to our medieval buildings, we would simply select that asset. We can see the price here, which is free, and we would click on download. Now, we would be downloading this asset. It'll tell us that we've already purchased an asset if we've already purchased it, if it's something for buying. This is one that we're just getting for free. It's going to download, and as soon as the download is finished, Unity is going to open up that asset once we tell it to import it. And here is the import for that particular set of assets. It's telling us here that there are some materials, some models here, some prefabs, some README files, some textures, and so forth. You can choose to not import everything. For example, if they've already got the prefabs here, I don't really need the models, so I will unselect those. I don't really need their README. I don't need a sample scene to show it off, those sorts of things. But I may want their textures and materials. However you want to do it. Some people would simply select all and bring everything in. I tend to be a little bit more selective because I don't want to pollute the project with lots of extra files. After that, click import, and Unity will import all of the things that you told it to import into your project. So we'll wait for a second for that to finish, and now we can see that our low poly medieval buildings has been imported. So now we have the materials, prefabs, and textures that we asked for originally. So we can go back to our scene, and let's just say we want to go ahead and delete this. So now we're going to create a new ground. We can do that here, 3D object, plane. Now that we have the plane there, we can go to our prefabs and simply drag them out. Just get a little bit closer to the plane. Drag them out. Now this particular asset is actually pretty big, and we would want to scale this one for certain. So we can go into, actually this is a good opportunity for us to go into the prefab view. Go in here, we select our object, go to scale, make it a little bit smaller, make it a little bit smaller, make it a little bit shorter. And now when we return, our object's small enough so we can go ahead and move that onto our ground plane. Let's move around and see. Yep, that looks right. So we can actually select our ground plane. Let's make that bigger. So the plane is currently at scale 1 by 1 by 1. Let's make that 20 by 20. So now we've got lots of land for our new town. So we can now select this object, this game object. If we were to drag a new one out, of course it is the same size. We don't have to go and rescale that one. But we can independently rotate it. So we can say I want to do a rotation. Let's make that a little bit different so we can see the front door. And voila, we're kind of starting to build a scene here. And there are other buildings here that we can drop in. And when you're dealing with prefabs, this is pretty much all you're doing. And all these buildings are actually pretty big. So the scale for these objects is a little bit different than what we'd want. We probably want to change the scale some so that it fits the rest of our scene. And that's something that you would have to play with when you're dealing with lots of art assets from multiple different sources. They may be scaled a little bit differently, and you would just scale those down or up as you need to. Now, as you're working with these objects, one thing you may notice is that some of them are going to have some highlight to them, like this one is somewhat highlighted. That means that that's the selected object. You have lots of objects here. You may decide that you need to move several of them at once. So you can either shift click them all in the project view, or you can control click if it's going to be additive addition, and then you can move them all together to wherever they need to go. So that's going to be your basic layout mechanism. If you need to grab multiple things, you can do that. And again, as I mentioned before, if you have a town that you're putting together, somebody's putting a grid together, you can simply add those to that plane, and then someone can take that plane and add it to their scene. So if you're going to do something like that, what I would recommend is that you work with a plane, and each one of those planes has a particular size, so that when you give it to someone, they will know that I can build around that particular size, so when I get your art assets, I can just drop them into my scene, and everything will work out just fine. Now, there are two more very useful things to know when you're talking about building scenes. And we'll get to texturing and so forth, because that's another topic that's really big for you when you're trying to add some flavor to your scenes and make them look a little bit more dynamic. But more importantly is making sure that you can actually see all of your stuff. So if we take a look at the game view, which is the view from the player's perspective, this is what the camera sees, you'll notice that it doesn't really see anything. And that's because our camera, if we go back to our scene view, is located here, and it's not in a position where it would actually be able to see anything. It is actually well below the ground plane that we have, and of course we can bring it around and move it and so forth, which is cool. But if we know where we want our camera to be, let's say we've moved to here, and we know that we want our camera to be here, a really helpful thing to do is to select our camera and do a Control-Shift-F, and that will make the camera focus the same position that our scene is focused. The same place that we're looking as the user is where the game camera will be positioned to, so the game camera now sees what we want it to see because we're looking at it. Now, one final thing that we're going to cover with respect to world building, and we'll do some more advanced world building a little bit later, but one simple thing that we need to cover is lighting. It's one of the most important things for your game to give it a mood and effect. We haven't talked about it yet. So in our scene right now, we have a single directional light. So directional lights, they have direction. They don't really have position. So the position component of a directional light is, for all practical purposes, ignored. Think of it as you getting this universal light from the sun or something like that, and the direction of that light is what is determining how your shadows are being cast. So if you move the light, its position doesn't do anything. But if you rotate the light, you'll notice that the shadows are in real time changing along with the rotation of the light. So directional lights are really good for things like sunlight or light sources where you want to have them globally affect your scene but not be tied to any one particular position in your scene. So another type of light that we can do We'll go ahead and add a new light. We have these point lights. Now, point lights are different in that they do have a position in the scene. Their position actually matters. And the reason it matters is because they have a range of effect. So when you put a point light somewhere in your scene, it is only going to impact your scene or impact the geometry wherever it is. Now, this one is a real-time light, so we're not going to see it here. But when we run the game, we would see that that light and its intensity has an impact on the things that are within its radius. Another type of light that we have is a spotlight, and that is exactly as the name implies. You do a spotlight, you put it somewhere, it's going to cast a particular light down within its circle or area of effect, and it has its fall off based off of how far something is from the light source. Another light that we have the ability to do, which you probably won't use in a hackathon, is an area light. And area lights are very similar to the point lights in that they have an area of effect and intensity and so forth, but these are baked lights. So when we talk about baking lights, essentially what Unity is going to do is it is going to say this light is going to impact the scene one time. So I am going to go through your entire scene and I'm going to change all of your textures to accommodate this light source, and then I'm going to modify the textures so that they reflect how this light would have impacted the scene. Really useful for being able to get certain types of effects without having to pay the price of having large numbers of lights. So this is really what area lights are for. So if you're doing things like having a street light or Christmas lights or something that is part of your scene and you want to get that effect, but you don't want to pay the performance price of having that light there all the time because it's not going to move, then you would use an area light for that. So in this lesson, we spent our time going through the whole world building process. We didn't build a very complex world, but we talked about the basics that would be necessary for you to build a very complex world. We spent a lot of time talking about grayboxing, so the process of laying out a level using generic art assets. Unity has a lot of graphic primitives that you really should use to start laying things out, get an idea for how your gameplay is going to work, get your playability down before you spend too much time working on trying to make everything beautiful. Then you also have Unity's Pro Builder, which is good for adding a bunch of specialty things like stairs and so forth. Cinti Studios has a Polygon starter pack, which is free. Go to the asset store, download that. There's a lot of cool assets for prototyping in there, and these are all designed with gray boxing in mind so that you can get your concept straight before you start working on making your level beautiful. Once you start making your level beautiful, your brain is going to switch into making everything aesthetically pleasing as opposed to making sure your game works properly. So I strongly recommend that you work with prototyping objects. You start with gray boxing, make it work, then make it beautiful, then make it fast. In that order, that's the best way to build a game. We talked a lot about lighting. We talked about the different types of lights, from the point lights, the directional lights, the spotlights, and the area lights. We saw that Unity will generate all of the shadows by itself. There are settings on the light, so if you don't want a light to cast a shadow, you can simply turn that off. But lighting is very powerful and very easy to use in Unity. Area lights and baking is probably something that you don't want to cover a whole lot of inside of your smaller hackathon type projects, but it's there if you want to. Just be sure to save some time for it because baking lights and generating the light maps that are used takes some time. And if your machines aren't very fast, or you just have other things to do and you're moving things around a lot, those light maps will get generated a lot of time and they will eat a lot of your computational time and brain cycles that you need to spend building your game. So with that, that's the end of part 2. Looking forward to part 3, where we will spend some time working on scripting, making our world a lot more interactive, and that's where the rubber is going to start meeting the road with respect to real gameplay. See you in a minute.